Well, ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, not so many girls and boys, but anyway, thank you for breaking off from your coffee and your lovely toasts and eggs and all the rest of it and making it to my little talk. So yeah, Russ, as he so kindly said, I'm from the Falkland Islands, which as we steam, I'm not quite sure which direction we're steaming in that way, I think. So we get to the tip of South America and we turn left and carry on for about a day, and we're in my hometown. It'll be my pleasure to introduce that place to you in a few days' time. But today we're looking at Punta Arenas, and I actually have a contact with Punta Arenas, a link, because back in the 40s, some elements of my family emigrated to Chile, and they wound up in Punta Arenas, and they're still there. So I still have cousins in Punta Arenas, and every now and again I manage to visit them, and it's like we've never really been apart. But it used to be a very wild area when one of my great uncles and aunts emigrated there, and no sooner had they arrived in Punta Arenas than the gentleman headed north towards Santiago, intending to reach Santiago, where he thought he would have a career doing meaningful work. He was never heard of again. And the assumption that the family made was that he fell in amongst unsavory characters, and they just don't know what happened. But that's how Patagonia was 80 or so years ago. And still, to this day, it's very difficult to travel from Punta Arenas up to Santiago. You either have to drive into Argentina and back again, or you have to take a ship. So some things haven't changed that much, although I hope it's considerably less violent in this part of the world now. So Punta Arenas, and I found out that the flag has meaning, and I thought that symbolism surely had something to do with the indigenous tribes that once roamed the area. Apparently it doesn't. The blue is representing the sky and the sea. The Southern Cross, the stars, indicates the hemisphere that we're in. The jagged edge is the Andes, and the white, apparently, symbolizes the sort of purity of the people. Well, you know, I'm sure they are very pure, but nothing indigenous in that whatsoever. A view here from the top of Punta Arenas. When we get there, if you walk up to the north of the town, you'll come across one or two miradores, or points at which you can look down over the town. So Punta Arenas, founded in 1848. It was in a strategic position, arguably it still is, at least until 1914, when the Panama Canal opened, and the ships that were traversing the passage from the Atlantic through to the Pacific had a much easier route through Panama. And suddenly places like my homeland, the Falklands, and Punta Arenas here had less importance in terms of shipping, less strategic importance perhaps, but there is still strategic importance here, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Population is around now 146,000, probably a bit more, but since I got that information out. And it is the world's most southerly city. I think I should say it is the world's most southerly substantial city. Because the people of Ushuaia, who are rather further to the south, would claim that honor for themselves. And now, of course, the people in Stanley also think they have a city, so, you know, there's a certain amount of unpleasantness about who's the most southerly city and who's the most important one, and so on and so forth. But there's no doubt that Punta Arenas is very important at the moment because it is the hometown of President Gabriel Boric. Now, that surname suggests that he is, in fact, from the Croatian community, which is a very large and important community in Punta Arenas. They came here towards the beginning of the 20th century during the boom times of sheep farming, and also a gold rush on Tierra del Fuego. So, first attempts at colonization. The Chilean government recognized the importance of this area from very early days. They knew that the Straits of Magellan were very important, and they had to have a sovereignty, a symbol of sovereignty in the area. So at that time there was a good deal of toing and froing between the colonial powers, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Brits, of course. Everybody was wanting to have territory down here. The Spanish established a rather grandly named settlement called Ciudad de Don Rey Felipe, which was only about 300 people, and it was just about 50 kilometers to the south of what is today Punta Arenas, in extremely barren terrain. It wasn't very well planned. The 300 or so people there, almost all starved. And I think my feeling is that that's probably quite a trend for this part of the world. The Europeans who decided or were forced to settle here for any amount of time frequently did starve because they didn't have the skills that the indigenous people did to find food. And I kind of detect the feeling from reading some things that they weren't particularly inclined to ask the Indians how to do things. There was a lot of starvation. Ciudad de Don Rey Felipe was in a place appropriately then named Port Famine. And I'm going to mention a couple of books as I go along. This is a particularly good one, which I'm reading at the moment. And the first captain of HMS Beagle suffered from terrible depression, as indeed did the second captain. And he shot himself during a visit to Port Famine. Sounds like a fairly grim book, and in places it is, but I can't recommend it enough. And as we're on the subject of the Beagle, did you know that while most ships of the time had a beautiful, graceful woman, you know, projecting out into the ocean as a bowsprit, as a figurehead, the Beagle had a little creature who looks remarkably like Snoopy to me. Snoopy the Beagle, right there. So Snoopy was on this Darwin and Fitzroy ship and also went to the moon, Apollo 10, I think. I'm a Snoopy fan, by the way, Peanuts fan generally. So the failure of the Spanish port at Puerto Famine did not stop the Europeans in Santiago from their enthusiasm to have a representation here in the south. And in 1843, near that original Puerto Famine, Fuerte Bulnes was created. And you can see this today. Fuerte Bulnes is quite an impressive reconstructed fort made out of timber, mainly from the forests in the region. It's actually a recreation because it was demolished. Named after Bulnes, who was the president in Santiago at the time. It only lasted for about 7 years, and it was abandoned in 1849 in favor of Punta Arenas, because it was not a site where one could expect many people to be sustained. But they were wise in building the fort because indeed the British and the French were sniffing around the area trying to plant flags. Apparently the day after the colonists from Santiago arrived at Fuerte Bulnes, so did the French. They attempted to plant a flag. They were politely told to go away. Perhaps not so politely, and they went on to discover Tahiti, so that was quite a nice consolation prize, I would think, for them. Flag flying really was still the purpose in founding Punta Arenas, originally called Magallanes. It had a role as a penal colony, and where unruly military people were sent for discipline posting. I don't suspect that anybody really thought Punta Arenas and the area around it would become such an economic powerhouse. But it wasn't too long before gold was discovered on Tierra del Fuego. So what comes when you discover gold? There's a gold rush, just the other side of the Straits of Magellan. But an easy boat ride away. So Punta Arenas was perhaps the headquarters and the trading center for that. And before long, sheep farming also became a massively important business. These days, there isn't that much money in sheep farming, but back around the end of the 19th, early 20th century, it was an incredibly valuable industry. And the flat land of Patagonia and into Tierra del Fuego was very good for sheep ranching, and we'll come back to that a little bit later on. So this boom time attracted really quite huge immigration from Croatia, as I mentioned, from Russia, from other parts, and also from Britain. And the British influence here was major. They set up banks, they set up shipping, and they already had control of the Falkland Islands. And so sheep were imported from the Falkland Islands. So I guess my folks somewhere way back had something to do with the introduction of sheep to this part of the world. Antarctic exploration as well, perhaps not envisaged at the time, but Antarctic exploration became massively important. But it really was shipping through the Magellan Straits, which made Punta Arenas very important. There was a regular shipping service from Europe that stopped in Punta Arenas and carried on up the west coast, I think as far as Valparaiso, certainly, and perhaps further north into Peru as well. That was a steamer service, again, before the advent of the Panama Canal. Shipping, again, looking at this, the French scientific ship Astrolabe visited much earlier, but this little vignette down here is the remains of the Lord Lonsdale. She was a typical early 20th century square rigger of the type which would fight her way around the Horn, up towards northern Chile for the cargo to take back to Europe, and then fight her way back down again. And she was wrecked in the Falklands, but towed over to Punta Arenas to be used either for timber products or as some kind of floating warehouse. But she still doesn't float, sorry. She's still on the beach just outside Punta Arenas, and you'll probably see her. Punta Arenas today is the gateway to Patagonia. And thousands of people, many thousands of people, flood through Patagonia every year, heading for the national park in Torres del Paine, and exploring towns along the way, and also into southern Argentina. So it's also a good stopping off point if you're exploring the southern part of Argentina, Lago Argentino. And we saw the most impressive glacier I've ever seen in my life yesterday. There's another one rather north in Argentine territory called Perito Moreno Glacier. So people from traveling through Punta Arenas today can make their way up there. So as I said earlier, the sheep farming industry became hugely important. And those people who were able to see the potential and the value first were able to snap up vast tracts of land. The government in Santiago was keen to do this. National barriers were not necessarily a problem, so the sheep farms would run from southern Argentina, perhaps near Rio Gallegos, down to and across the water into Tierra del Fuego, where Rio Grande was the main trading town. But Punta Arenas, again with its great shipping connections and its central position, remained the main point. But when we get to Punta Arenas, you will see the evidence of the quite staggering wealth that this industry created, especially around the Plaza de Armas in the center. And I think that perhaps your exploration of the town will begin around the Plaza de Armas. And the buildings are straight out of the Belle Epoque in France. This is the Palacio Serra Brown, and I'll talk about Serra Brown, who is an interesting person from history, certainly controversial as she never used to be. And she built this as her home, employing a French architect to come down here with many French fittings. And we'll have a look in it a bit later. But there are other buildings like this, and they just really demonstrate the astonishing wealth of that time. Needless to say, I guess it's needless to say, because wherever Europeans go in search of wealth, which involves taking over land, more often than not, there were perfectly legitimate indigenous people there before. And this, needless to say, happened here. So working out from Punta Arenas and into the southern part of Argentine Patagonia and into Tierra del Fuego, the Patagonian native people were really exterminated. There's no other word for it, really. Not all of it was necessarily deliberate, but the introduction of diseases that they had no means of handling saw off many people, but also their culture was subverted by missionaries, particularly, and I don't wish to badmouth the Salesians, but particularly the Salesian missionaries who worked this area into Tierra del Fuego, again, based in Punta Arenas. And the subversion of the native culture, even if people survive, means that there is no more cohesion. So it's a sad story from start to finish. But by the 1980s, the Chilean government were able to say, I'm sure with no pride whatsoever, that all indigenous Patagonian peoples were extinct, except for the Mapuche. Now, the Mapuche are quite interesting. They were concentrated rather further north, but they are now campaigning for the return of their ancestral lands, and of course, that is dividing opinion in Chile. The Selknam people were established on Tierra del Fuego, and they, I feel, were a particularly sad story. I give you this photo, this utterly heartbreaking photograph, really with a little bit of reluctance because it's just so heartbreaking. The Salesian mission, I don't think, meant any great harm, but probably did very little good. But among them was a priest called Alberto Maria de Agostini, who was, among other things, a very fine photographer, and he documented the Selknam people, the lives of the Selknam people, and worked with them. And so this photograph and many others, you can go to the Salesian Museum in Punta Arenas, and I would recommend you do. When I first went there, it was a rather musty, dusty place, but I believe it's been done up now, and it's more interactive and it's more modern. And I think if you want to understand the lives of the Indians of the area, and if you want to understand something about the geology, the natural history, and so on and so forth, and the fossils that have been found in the area, then I think it's well worth a visit. But the Selknam people were in this area down here on Tierra del Fuego. There was another tribe which occupied the coastal area, and they were not such a concern to the ranchers dominated by the Brown and Menendez families. The Brown and Menendez families by this time had taken over in the region of 3 million hectares of land, just an astonishing amount of land stretching from that area up there right down to almost to Cape Horn across Tierra del Fuego. The Selknam people, concentrated there, were used to hunting guanaco. When the ranchers arrived, of course, the first thing they did was put up fences, wire fences, and they introduced sheep. And I suspect they also shot off the guanaco. What were the Indians to do? They, understandably to some extent, began slaughtering sheep and were declared nothing but a pest. So with the authority of the government, the farmers in the area, basically the Menendez and the Brown families who were working together, murdered some 4,000 of Selknam people, and it was nothing short of a genocide. I think that's something that people are grappling with now. Sarah Brown, who we'll perhaps mention again later on, was generally recognized for her charity and the wonderful things that she did, and you will see her name everywhere. But she ran this great farming family, and was never really associated with the murder, the mass-scale murder. But I believe now her reputation and that of the families is being reassessed, and I would say rightly so. So, Punta Arenas and the Antarctic. Punta Arenas is roughly halfway between the north of Chile and the South Pole. So that's more coincidence than anything else, but there is a monument. When you go to Fuerte Bulnes, you can stop by a monument that says this is halfway between the very north of Chile and the South Pole. Now, the Chileans actually do have a claim over the South Pole. If you look at the map, it's divided up into slices of cake, and the Chileans have a slice which runs down through the Antarctic Peninsula, right down to the South Pole, and they have been heavily involved in Antarctic exploration. They're perhaps most famous in history for rescuing the British-Irish hero Ernest Shackleton. I'm not going to go over that whole story, but after his ship, the Endurance, was lost in the Weddell Sea, Shackleton and his men managed to get to Elephant Island, where they were okay for a while. Shackleton, with 4 or 5 other men, made this journey here to South Georgia and then back to South America, where he tried a few times to get down to Elephant Island to rescue his men. But the only person who managed was this gentleman, a Chilean hero, and justly so, Piloto Luis Alberto Pardo. And he left Punta Arenas on this incredibly small ship. It's a tugboat, a steam tugboat, crossed the dreaded Drake Passage all the way down to Elephant Island, with Shackleton on board, and Shackleton was delighted to see that all his men on Elephant Island had survived. The Yelcho came back to Punta Arenas several days later, and the reception they got was historic. It was remarkable, and people haven't forgotten. So it's still important. President Boric recently went to the South Pole, which was a symbolic visit, really, but clearly he was stating Chile's interest. And he said Chile's plan, he didn't say it, sorry, but Chile's plan to grow its part in climate research, care for the environment, and Antarctic work internationally was confirmed by him, and that comes from an outfit called South Atlantic News. So it's about 24 hours passage from Punta Arenas down to the Antarctic Peninsula there. Some of us in this room have undoubtedly done it. Some of us have been lucky, and we've experienced the Drake Lake, which means it's flat as a pancake, and nobody needs to worry about it. My wife Nadia and I did it. Look who's grinning at you up there, about a year ago, and we had a sort of moderate experience. It wasn't too bad, but it was brilliant to do the crossing. You can actually fly from Punta Arenas to Antarctica as well. This outfit, Aerovías DAP, operate a jet service into, I think, King George Island. And even day visits are possible, but there is some accommodation at King George Island too. But that's going to have to wait for another time, because it's much easier. We don't have that much time in Punta Arenas, and it's much easier for those who wish to see penguins to go to Magdalena Island, which is one of the day excursions on offer from Punta Arenas. And you'll see Magellanic penguins and possibly Gen 2 penguins as well. And at some point, around when we get to the Falklands, I'll be quizzing you about your knowledge of penguins. See if you can recognize them just by the stripes around the head. They all have distinctive markings around the head. So what should we do on our day in Punta Arenas? As I say, the obvious thing to do really is to buy a shore excursion, which you probably have done already, and they're exceptional value, and you will see everything that you want to see. But the chances are that you'll be back in time to just wander around the streets of Punta Arenas as well, and I would recommend that, really. it's a great town to wander in because it's not huge. And everything really starts from the plaza. Every Chilean town has a Plaza de Armas. And this Plaza de Armas is actually particularly nice. Some people say it's one of the most beautiful in southern South America. Again, it's exhibiting the wealth that this town enjoyed about 100 years ago and well into the 20th century, in fact. The Silesian Museum, which I mentioned earlier in connection with the Selknam and the other indigenous people, that's it as it looks today. So plenty of well-lit display cases and interactive options. And also these models of the people of the time. These are arrowheads carved from whalebone. And whales, by the way, were also quite important. So if there were a whale was washed up dead, then that was food and materials. The bone was useful as well for very many people. So one reason why, anyway, in theory, Magellan decided that Tierra del Fuego was the land of fire. It's quite likely that the natives there had discovered the carcass of a whale and lit a large bonfire to attract everybody else in so that they could enjoy this feast of food and material. But he saw the fires and declared it as the land of fire, Tierra del Fuego. And those would be whalebone tools. Just off the square, the Plaza de Armas, is the Palacio Cerebrón. This is the lady who I mentioned earlier. She was the head of the Brown family, Latvian by birth. She and her family, as a little girl, she and her family came to South America to escape anti-Jewish pogroms, and they settled first of all in Buenos Aires, explored Paraguay as well, and the north of Argentina, but eventually were offered some opportunities down in Magallanes. So she traveled to this area with her parents, married a businessman called Noguera, just checking the time, and that marriage only lasted about 5 years until Noguera died, and Sarah Brown took over, and she was an astute businesswoman. She, with her brother and in cooperation with the Menendez family, began establishing these vast sheep farms across Tierra del Fuego and the southern part of Argentine, Patagonia as well. But you can see that is her home, built by French designers, fitted out with French furniture and British furniture of the highest quality. And you can still go there. Last time I was there, I went and had some lunch in that summer garden area at the front. Very good food. And within that building, there is the Shackleton Bar. And the Shackleton Bar is lined with photographs of Shackleton's expedition of Piloto Pardo, who rescued them, and the whole story is well illustrated. So if you're interested in that, do go there, and you'll just see, it's also now owned by the Union Club, and the Union Club has associate arrangements with other clubs around the world. So if you're in an exclusive club in New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, or London, just check your membership. You might be able to go in and enjoy the facilities there for free. The Magallanes Regional Museum is housed in what was once the Brown Menendez so-called palace. And that was built in 1903, and its opulence was and is quite remarkable. It's very much like Sarah Brown's house, everything imported. The Belle Epoque meets Punta Arenas. It's quite remarkable. The Magallanes Regional Museum moved into it, and but wherever you go, really, in fact, almost wherever you go in Punta Arenas, the Sarah Brown name leaps out at you. Now, even if you go to the municipal cemetery, and this I thoroughly recommend, it is one of the most remarkable cemeteries I've ever been to, because the cemetery displays the wealth of these incredibly successful landowners and ship owners and traders. And in those days, perhaps still, people want to be remembered in death with the kind of wealth that they enjoyed in life. And there is even here no escape from Mrs. Brown, because the subtitle of the cemetery is Sarah Brown, the Sarah Brown Municipal Cemetery. And she paid for this ornate entrance. So it's Sarah Brown prevails. If you're interested in nautical history and the Magallanes, the Straits of Magellan, and the Punta Arenas connection with it, I would urge you to have a look at the Museo Nau Victoria, which is some way away where we will be in the center of the town here. And the Museo Nau Victoria is up to the northeast. Probably a short taxi drive, no big deal. You'd be there in about 5 to 10 minutes in a taxi. And at this museum, quite remarkably, they have built replicas, full-size replicas of some of the most important ships to travel through this area. Beagle, HMS Beagle, which carried the amazing navigator Fitzroy and that remarkable scientist Charles Darwin, is there. You can board it and have a look around. The little James Caird, which was the boat that Shackleton and his crew took from Elephant Island to South Georgia, and in so doing managed to rescue his entire crew, has been reconstructed, is in the museum as well. So it's worth a visit. And then everything on a smaller scale, but again, if naval history interests you, there's the Museo Naval y Marítimo, bang in the center, again, about 5 minutes walk from the plaza. As Sarah Brown never said, because she would never be seen out of her crinoline and fancy hats and all that posh, beautiful sort of turn-of-the-century clothing, dress for Patagonia, because I think we got a little taste of it yesterday. It can get very cold, so dress in layers and wear sensible shoes, nothing that Sarah Brown would approve of. Just to give you some idea, I don't actually believe this map tells us an awful lot, because you really need to be in the central town square around there to be able to orientate yourself. But I think the places you really should visit, the plaza itself with its statues and various other things, the Palacio Sarah Brown, which I showed you, which has a restaurant and cafe where you can go in and look at the Shackleton story painted large, and the Salesian Museum to learn about the indigenous people, the Magallanes Regional Museum, which is also associated with the Brown Menendez story, and the Municipal Cemetery, some way out, maybe a taxi ride, but do go to the Municipal Cemetery if you can possibly manage it. Now, I said I mentioned a few books here. I don't know if you're like me and you sort of became more aware of the mystique and the mystery and the attraction and the legend and myth of Patagonia through this book, but even though I lived not that far away in the Falklands, I loved this book by Bruce Chatwin in Patagonia. And we don't have time to do it while we're in Punta Arenas, but it is possible to make a day trip, a very long day trip, from Punta Arenas to the cave of the Milodon. Now, the Milodon was thought by Bruce Chatwin and others to have been some kind of dinosaur. It wasn't. It was a large sloth. And it and its comrades lived in the caves and around them in the area slightly to the south, I think my direction's right, of Torres del Paine National Park. Torres del Paine is also absolutely remarkable. You can do the same in the same day. Better if you can stay over for a little while in Torres del Paine. So I think that what I would thoroughly recommend you do is go to the central square, the Plaza de Armas, and orientate yourself from there. There is a tourist booth there, and they will give you maps so that you can explore the area. If you have any questions, I think they will be more than happy to answer them. But there are those 4 or 5 places that I think you should visit. And also to the south of the town are what they call miradores. So you could take a taxi drive and say, can you please take me to the Mirador, I'm trying to remember, the Mirador Cerro Cruz. The Mirador Cerro Cruz, which looks down on the town and across the Straits of Magellan. So that's something that's well worth doing if you enjoy the scenic sights, panoramas, and if you've got your camera. Now, I just thought I'd introduce you to this little thing up here. I'm actually wearing it now. It's an arrowhead, which when my father was in Punta Arenas visiting my cousins and aunts in 1965, one of my cousins used to go out into the Patagonian steppes, for want of a better word, and they would look for arrowheads in ponds or little lakes that had dried out, because the Indian tribespeople would go hunting for wildfowl on these freshwater ponds, fire their arrows, probably miss half the time. The arrows would drift into the sediment at the bottom of the pond or lake. The arrow shaft would rot away. But if one looked carefully, hundreds of years later, maybe even thousands of years later, you could find these arrowheads. And when my dad passed away, I found in one of his little boxes of treasures this arrowhead. So I mounted it, and I still wear it. And I genuinely find it moving that I have this little beautiful thing created by one of the tribes, one of the indigenous peoples of southern Patagonia. And it's a fine piece of work, and I always find it quite moving when I look at it. So that's one of my little treasures now. And we didn't see enough corrugated iron, but if you travel any distance in Patagonia and in Tierra del Fuego, you realize that what really built the industry and established people in this country was corrugated iron. And I would go a bit further and say corrugated iron and barbed wire. Without those two materials, I don't think that this place could have been colonized so quickly and so easily. And its massive sheep farming industry could have been developed in the way it was, and I might add, in the rather merciless way it was. So enjoy Punta Arenas. I hope that little touch on the history of it, some of which perhaps people cannot be so proud. On the other hand, it's fair to point out that the pioneering people in this part of the world were tough, and they came from very distant parts of the world in search of a better life. Many of them found it. Most of the families are still here today. So, folks, thank you very much for your time. I think it's very fortunate for the National Football League that I'm talking today and not tonight. Otherwise, the NFL wouldn't stand a chance, would they? Thank you very much.